Hi, I'm Maya Berry, and welcome to Viewpoint. Jim is off this week. Tonight, we'll discuss the situation in Lebanon with Mark Perry, director of the Conflicts Forum. Then, Jonathan Broder of Congressional Quarterly will be here with us to provide analysis of the Israeli peace movement. But our first guest tonight is Dr. Philip Gordon. He's a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Prior to his position at Brookings, he was director for European affairs at the National Security Council. He's just finished a book due out this summer in August entitled Winning the Right War, The Path to Security for America and the World, which offers a new strategy for winning the war on terror, quote unquote, I will say it that way. I want to start by saying thank you very much for joining us today. And for our viewers, this is our first time on this new time schedule. For those of you returning, thank you for joining us. Those of you finding us for the first time, thanks for being with us as well. Let's start by talking about Europe, perhaps. I know I want to kind of focus our conversations on Turkey, but I want to start with the French elections. And my first question has to be with the fact that having worked on campaigns, one of the things I found most interesting about this is not just the result, which some found surprising, but the 85% voter turnout. So if I can ask you both to comment on those two, and we'll kind of start our discussion that way.
Well, the turnout was important. You're right to stress that. It was much higher than in previous elections, and I think the reason is the French decided it mattered. Unlike in the previous two elections, where you had Jacques Chirac against Lionel Jospin, and people sort of looked at them both and said, you know what, it doesn't much matter. They're similar policy, people, individuals, same old thing. They looked at these candidates and said, you know, we actually have a real choice. And I actually think this was the biggest choice the French had to make since 1981, when you had François Mitterrand on the hard left with the communists, as a real alternative to capitalism with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and a very different approach. And this time it wasn't that great a gap, but there was a real choice to be made, mainly because Nicolas Sarkozy, who ended up winning, was such a different candidate, pro-American, pro-free market. So I think one reason they turned out, well, there were two reasons they turned out. One is because it mattered, and the other was because the candidates were interesting. I mean, both of these were unique people. Sarkozy, for some of the reasons I said, and then Ségolène Royal, the first woman with a real shot at the Élysée. So both of those things, I think, created a real buzz in France, and democracy worked.
They talk about him as a major mold breaker in some ways. He can't be so much pigeonholed in a particular way. What are some of the things about him that have been so different, and what can the world sort of expect from that?
Yeah, he really is different. He's different because he comes from a different path to power. All of the other presidents went to ENA, the National Administration School, sort of elite French society, traditional. Nicolas Sarkozy is the son of an immigrant, an outsider, really. And in a way, many people think that sort of explains his drive and ambition. He was just so determined not to be the immigrant, not to be the poor guy, but he was going to succeed just based on sheer will and personality and energy, and he certainly has a lot of energy. So part of it is just the personality thing. He's a different type of person, but he also has different policies. You can start domestically. He actually ran criticizing the French model. He said, this isn't working, guys. All of the other French leaders would emphasize, we have to preserve this, we have to preserve that, we can't change too much. He said he was the candidate of change. And he said specifically, you actually have to tell voters you're going to change things, because otherwise you won't have a mandate for change if and when you're elected. And he took a risk, because a lot of people felt, and I have to admit I was one of them, that the French didn't really want change. And that they would look at him and he would be threatening to change things, and then they would look at an alternative, a socialist candidate, and she was telling them, no, we'll have the social protections, and we won't
status quo would.
Yeah. In her case, she could incarnate change just because she looked different. She didn't look like Jacques Chirac, but don't worry, I'm not going to change the policies that you're so comfortable with. And he sort of looked at the French voters and said, no, I'm really going to change things. And they went for him anyway, which I think surprised a lot of people. And so that's true domestically, where he says we need to cut taxes and stimulate growth. It's a bit much to compare him to Thatcher or Reagan in that sense, but on the French spectrum, it's quite serious, yeah, to say we want to bring the tax burden down. He kept stressing merit and work and rewarding for work, whereas the socialists proposed, 35-hour work week, social protection. He said, no, you want to make more money, work harder. After he was elected, he went off on this yacht for a few days and ostentatiously said there's nothing wrong with that. For the French, that's, you don't do that, and you shouldn't flaunt wealth, and a lot of French people still are uncomfortable with this whole very American notion of, earn more and do better and pay for merit. So he's very different in all those sense, and on foreign policy he's also different.
Now, this was one of those elections that was watched very closely here in America, partly because of the sense that we've strained our relationships with France recently. What has been the take here since then?
Well, I mean, it depends whose take you're talking about, which party, which part of we have our own divisions in America. I think it's fair to say that most Americans were quite pleased. They were intrigued. They were intrigued by both candidates. But the notion that someone could run for president of France by saying, I don't apologize for being a friend of America. And even wherever you are on the pro-Bush or anti-Bush, the American part of it, I think most Americans were comfortable with the idea that rather than what most people assume is traditional French anti-Americanism, Sarkozy wrote a book that he published here in which he begins by saying, I'm not going to apologize, I admire America. He was also clear there are things he doesn't like about America. But just that was such a refreshing change after years of what many perceived to be anti-Americanism that I think there was a lot of applause in the US when he was elected.
European Union has also sort of looked at him in terms of what's coming next. But I want you to kind of both address that and maybe segue into our discussion of Turkey, because one of the places where he really has very strong viewpoints that of concern to Turkey is in regards to their ascension into the EU.
Exactly. I was just in Turkey, and they are paying a lot of attention to Nicolas Sarkozy all through the papers, because he did, when he won on the election night, he gave a speech. He mentioned a lot of foreign policy things, which was interesting in itself, because it was sort of a statement that he's going to be a foreign policy president. He mentioned the US, he mentioned Europe, and he said France is back in Europe. That seemed to imply that Chirac wasn't as vigorous as he could have been in promoting the European Union. But I think it would be wrong to assume that that means he's a real integrationist and he's going to push forward a sort of federal model with the EU constitution. I think, you could almost call him Eurosceptical. He is a French nationalist. He wants to defend French companies and French national interests, and he's going to drive a hard bargain. And that's what we see going on now. There are at least two parts of the European agenda. The first is just fixing this constitutional mess. Proposed constitution, the French voters and the Dutch voters reject it in a referendum 2 summers ago, and it's been stalled ever since. And that's been the stumbling block for EU progress lately. And Sarkozy has a plan that is probably going to work for lack of alternatives. He's basically saying, we're not going to have another referendum. Let's just take the bits of the treaty that aren't controversial, ask the parliament to pass them and implement them, and then we can move forward. And that's what he's trying to sort out with the Germans now, that it's the German presidency of the EU. And so that's the first step, is to get this institutional block out of the way so they can move forward. And to do that, he's promised not to raise the issue that you mentioned, which is his opposition to Turkish membership. It's been controversial throughout the EU for a long time. There's nothing new about that. And one has suspected that a lot of European leaders aren't too enthusiastic about it, but Sarkozy is quite clear. He doesn't think Turkey is a European country, and he doesn't think they should be in the EU.
We're going to come back to Turkey, a focus of our conversation. First, we're going to allow our viewers to join us on our conversation, and international callers should call 001-202-842-5056. Here in the U.S., the number is 1-800-528-2090.